Kaiju Fest panel on 55 years of the Daimajin Trilogy. I am your co-host, Kent, and with me is your other co-host.
Jason, what's going on?
And so I just want to go ahead and put a disclaimer on all this, like we have with, I think, just about all of our anniversary discussions at this point. We are not diving into any behind-the-scenes information or history on the production of the movies in question and trying to make it academic in any way, shape, or form. There are other resources out there that tend to chronicle this stuff better. And we felt that it was more appropriate, anyways, to discuss these films more in a celebratory manner when possible. Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, unfortunately, was kind of the exception. Um, to celebrate kind of milestones and to talk about these particular films and to hopefully more than not praise them and just kind of maybe discuss kind of their impact within tokusatsu. Technically, tokusatsu is not a genre, kaiju-dom or just special effects films from Japan. So take it away, Jason. 55 years of the Daimajin Trilogy.
Oh boy, where to begin on this one? And I know we discussed or commentated on this about several months ago, if I remember correctly, last year.
Yeah, we started October, November for the first one, and then here, like 2 months ago, we just wrapped up the other two films.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, as of this recording, I must say.
Yep. And uh, that was the last time I viewed the original Daimajin, and I think, was it several years ago? This when it was the first viewing for the both of us. I'm not sure who discovered these movies. I'm assuming you did. Uh, Discovered the whole Daimajin trilogy, and I think from the first viewing and up to the last viewing, like every year, I believe it's gotten to be better over time as with us getting older. And I think out of all of the three movies, I think the when it comes to the characters, the plot, the score, the both practical and visual effects, I think this movie, in my opinion, is one of the better, if not probably the best film of this entire trilogy. I really like the characters in this movie. I mean, you got some of the familiar faces, such as I forget who. I know the face, but it's been some time to. Uh, it's
Are you talking
it's
about Kojiro Hongo?
Kujiro Hongo. Yeah, yeah. I'm not seeing his name.
He's in the second one,
Okay, yeah.
Return of Daimajin.
Re- yeah, I always get him mixed up for some reason, but yeah, the characters in this one are really good. You don't. So let me backtrack a little bit. You don't get some of the familiar faces in here, but the characters are really good in their own right. And what I have to say, as far as the design of Daimajin himself, is really good. I mean, you get that whole Japanese traditional type of uh, kind of mask that you see,
Samurai.
samurai look or mask or whatever, that you see in a lot of the like paintings and pictures from way back when. It's Daimajin is a really good film.
Yeah, anybody who has followed us since about 2013, which was when I first viewed these films, it was early January 2013, knows that by and large, I have enjoyed this trilogy. The third one, not so much. In fact, kind of an ongoing joke there for a while was how much I despised the kids in the third film, Daimajin Strikes Again, and I was always rooting for their demise. And and I'm with Jason. With each year, this whole trilogy gets better. I've always enjoyed the first two, and the second one's always been my favorite, which is Return of Daimajin. I love Kojiro Hongo. I love a lot of the characters in there. Some of the actors in there are actors you have seen in some of the Gamera films. And of course, the Daimajin trilogy was produced by Dai in 1966, all three films. You had the first film, Daimajin, come out kind of within the first portion of that year, Return of Daimajin around the middle, and then obviously Daimajin Strikes Again towards the end.
Mm.
And I, even with the third one, I have grown to enjoy it with repeated viewings. And the kids have become slightly less annoying each time I watch. In fact, I'm becoming a bit more endeared to them. Um, I, I think part of it was that it was so jarring that I thought that the dubbing of some of those child characters when I first saw this one was so jarring that I was just like, dude, like just die already so I don't have to hear your voice anymore. But that was a film that ended up getting dubbed by Mill Creek, who originally um, brought this trilogy out into Blu-ray in the late aughts. um, Not the late aughts, but kind of the earliest aughts. And in fact, Diabolique, as of this recording, is just a couple months away from releasing. Well, not Diabolique. Diabolique sells it, but Arrow Video, I should say, is a couple months away from releasing the Daimajin trilogy again on Blu-ray. But this time, there's going to be more supplemental material. That's going to get released at the end of July. So when you're viewing this Daikaiju Fest, you're talking about maybe 2-3 weeks away until that set has been released. And I already have pre-ordered it. I'm really looking forward to seeing what we get from Arrow Video out of this new Daimajin trilogy. And you can't find the original Mill Creek Daimajin trilogy anymore unless you're willing to spend a bunch of money on copies that people have already purchased, more or less scalpers. Thank you, assholes. But I I've really just come to enjoy this trilogy. The first Daimajin I really do enjoy. I think the one thing about that particular film that I enjoy more than the second one, which is my favorite, is how Daimajin disposes of the villain at that one, where he takes this big spike out of his head in which the villains had tried putting it into him when he was a stone idol earlier to try to break him apart, and he impales the villain to like the side of a building in the in the village. It's so grotesque, but it's so satisfying at the same time. Whereas in Return of Daimajin, he disposes of the villain by sending a flame out to this boat in which the villain's trying to escape in, and the guy burns alive, which is somewhat satisfying. But there's just something about watching a guy just getting impaled that just comes off as more satisfying, even though a guy burning to death is very slow and agonizing. But um, the third one, Daimajin Strikes Again, what I really enjoy about that film in particular is I think the cinematography in that film is so much better than what we get in the first two. And that's not to say that the cinematography in Daimajin and Return of Daimajin is bad. No. But the cinematography, I think, is just greater in the fact that you have uh, more uh, you have different settings, more scenery. The
Much
kids are
more
on a Lord of the
adventurous.
Rings type of quest, and
Yeah.
so as a result, you're getting different um, terrains being filmed as a result. Not to mention, towards the end, you're getting a little bit of snow. Even though the snow is definitely fakeish looking because it is, it still is very beautiful. You get a wider color palette and something from a visual standpoint that is broader than what you get in those first two films.
Yeah, like with you mentioned there that uh, Daimajin Strikes Again. That's the more adventurous film out of the three, uh, out of the entire trilogy. Whereas the first two just felt more like that they were uh, in studio sets, whereas uh, even though with the entire trilogy filmed or done within the same year, I'm not entirely sure what was their reason of having the third and final one just being sort of separate from the first two and having that more adventurous sort of aspect. It would have been nice if
To
all,
make it, just to try to make it different enough.
yeah. Well, it would have been nice if they sort of done similar things to the first two, but
By
um,
and large, they do, though.
maybe a little bit, but not quite as adventurous as the third one. But I think in their own right, out with the three movies, I think that they fit within their own their own whole story uh, aspect of yeah. Uh, as far as the characters in the first one, what do you make of the characters in the first Daimajin? I mean, we don't get the familiar faces that we do with Hongo in the second one, but uh, how did you come out after watching the first film with these characters as far as the main characters and then the main villain?
Um, as far as the characters in Daimajin go, I liked them more or less. Um, I I guess I don't necessarily want to say I was in love with them, but I thought they were good enough. I thought they were just ever so slightly above par. I enjoyed them by and large. The villains, I will say, the villains in all three films are terrific. They definitely are characters that you love to hate. These are guys you definitely want to see get their comeuppance. And by and large, their comeuppance is pretty satisfying. Um, One of the things I want to say, though, about this whole trilogy, one of the reasons why I like it is that when I initially first discovered these films, I had just wrapped up my final semester at university, and one of those final classes I took during that last semester was a samurai course. And it covered the samurai, gosh, over a period of, I think, 2,000 years, maybe. And um, it was an awesome course taught by an awesome professor. And we occasionally got to see clips of various samurai type movies, including a few clips from some Akira Kurosawa films. And so at the time I first discovered these and first watched these, I wasn't that far removed from my samurai course. And on some level, I was able to understand and really just dive into the feudal Japan time aspect of these three films. And I've always thought the samurai period was kind of interesting too, but I found it to be much more interesting after I took that course in my final year at university. And Japanese culture to me and Japanese history, because I am a history major. And so history in a general sense is very interesting to me. But because, of course, I'm a kaiju fan and all that, and have been a kaiju fan for almost 30 years, my interest in Japan continues to grow with each passing year. So I want to know more. You can't see it, but I've got like a handful of Japanese history books there, and you definitely can't see it, but I've got a book that's like this thick on the history of Japan on my other bookshelf right behind me. And I've always found it very interesting, the whole samurai journey, and the fact that when we think of samurai, we think of the samurai in a similar sense to what we see in the Daimajin films, and even a little bit later when you start getting more of the shogun type of samurai.
Hmm.
Um, the thing is that the samurai lasted for thousands of years, and over a period of X amount of periods within Japanese history, what it meant to be a samurai and what it meant to sort of physically become a samurai changed with each period in Japanese history. And so that's another thing about these films that I love. For years before I even saw these films, I had always heard that the Daimajin films, to many people, were good, if not decent films, but a lot of people felt let down because Daimajin tends to only show up in the final 10, 15 minutes of the film.
Hmm.
And for me, for many years, I was like, I don't know if I really want to seek these out then. And then when I found out that they were on Blu-ray and all that, and had been on Blu-ray for a short while, and I could purchase them, I purchased them. And I thought to myself, well, worst case scenario, yeah, I'm kind of disappointed. If it doesn't work out, maybe I can just get rid of these, or sell these Blu-rays. And like I said, I watched these shortly after graduating and having taken that samurai course. And while I initially, during my first viewings, I was kind of disappointed in the lack of Daimajin, even though I knew that was going to be the case. What ended up helping me over time in my ever growing love of these films is that whole samurai time period and
Hmm.
just the aesthetics of this, and the fact that these Daimajin films, I don't think, could be as good as they are unless you have that feudal Japan setting. You try to do something like that in a contemporary period, it's going to, unless there's some way you could sit down and write out a very good, convincing story, it's going to come off as very contrived and not believable enough. What
Hmm.
makes these Daimajin films so good is partially due to the time period in which they're set in.
Yeah, and like I think probably right around the same time as you were in that whole samurai course over at the university there there has been a time period for me, and also over the years, that I've sort of sought out some of these samurai films, and hell, I've even got some over in my DVD case over there where I got
Oh yeah, I got some too,
yeah,
mainly
some of the
Kurosawa.
some of the similar familiar Kurosawa films like Yojimbo Sanjudo, Seven Samurai, and then I've got like was it Rashomon, uh, was it Hidden
Throne of
Fort?
Blood.
Yeah, well, I don't have that one, but I think
I do.
I've seen that one. But
The
Hidden
good one.
Fortress, that one is really good. And like about every year, sort of right around March, well, like once every year, I sort of bring out like some of those movies and watch them. And I really like how some of those movies were done. And just by watching these movies over the years, and then watching the Daimajin trilogy uh, over time, that sort of really kind of you know blends right in to like those films that we've seen or have been interested in over the years, and just the story, the setting. Um, yeah, it's really good, but just with the aspect of having some kind of giant deity, uh, like the tokusatsu sort of thing mixed in with Daimajin, for me at least, kind of adds a little bit of flavor into that whole samurai genre aspect and makes it a little bit more interesting. You know, just like was a Journey to the West, uh, different interpretations of that movie. I've seen those like the Monkey King and stuff. I think I've seen those on YouTube and everything. It's really good. You know, if you're interested in a lot of the fantasy and samurai stuff, I think this would be right up your alley.
Well, and the thing about the whole samurai aspect is that the Daimajin trilogy is not really about feudal Japan and being a samurai and that culture.
Hmm.
Like I said a moment ago, I think more than anything else, the setting of it being in feudal Japan is more to serve the aspect of the god like deity within the title character of Daimajin. And each Daimajin is different. They sort of in the three films represent an elemental. You have, I think it's the first one, I think is wind. The second one, I know for sure, is water. The third one, I think,
Probably
is
Earth.
yeah, that's what I'm thinking is earth. And I never realized that until like X number of viewings. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Like, these are different Daimajins. And as a result, they are representative of different elements. And I think that's really cool. The samurai aspect, again, though, is more to serve that purpose of making this deity story, I think, more convincing and believable.
Hmm.
But what you get in all three Daimajin films is a very similar story. And this is a story that is very timeless. The only difference is the time period and how this aspect is represented. And what is represented in all three films is a type of oppression and authoritarianism. You have, one leader and his band who ends up usually overthrowing a more peaceful ruler, and we definitely see this in the first one for sure.
In the second
Overthrowing,
one,
and the
yeah.
second one, yeah. Um, Overthrowing a more kinder type of regime for authoritarian purposes. And like I said, again, the samurai aspect is more just to serve the godlike deity aspect and kind of this quote unquote simplicity of the peoples. Because even though, yes, you get a lot of people in contemporary societies across the globe who are still very religious today, that number is so much lower than it is like in the days of feudal Japan. Because of science and such advancements, people have been able now to explain certain things that could not have been explained before. And so you don't even have to be a fan of samurai films to really enjoy these stories, because these stories are about oppression, freeing people. And while by and large, in a general sense, all three films are very similar, there are some differences between the films as well. The first film is kind of this prince and his sister, a princess, trying to kind of reclaim their throne, so to speak. In the second one, it's kind of similar, but it's not the hero's journey aspect
Hmm.
that we get in the first film. And in the third film, it's about this band of children who are trying to find their fathers who have been taken by this authoritarian ruler to go work in the sulfur pits. And basically, these guys are being worked to death. And so the general story is the same, but some of the minutia is different. And that's another thing that I think is so wonderful. It's not necessarily uh, full-fledged carbon copies, even though you can easily make the argument that in some aspects, yes, there are quite a few almost exact similarities between the three films, but they are different enough to where they give you something unique, to where it distinguishes one entry from the next.
Hmm. And with that, as far as the score, to all the Daimajins, and I believe that all of them have been scored by Akira
Okay.
Fukube.
Yep.
Um, and I just from hearing most of the score to the Daimajin Trilogy, they're a bit similar to the Godzilla uh, music that we've heard before, and that's sort of one of the problems that we've discussed for many years when it comes to Fukube music. I mean, granted, he's one of the most familiar faces that we've known as far as the whole kaiju and tokusatsu film scoring. But one of the downsides to Akira Fukube, it seems like he doesn't really go outside the box, as we've mentioned before, for many years, and he still kind of keeps this familiar type of music that he's sort of familiar with, and just he sort of tweaks it a little bit, but most of the time they're almost too similar to one another from film to film, even when they're completely different.
Yeah, I mean, I remember having a discussion like this, and again, this is probably something that's not going to be very popular amongst people, but yeah, I mean, Ifukube, when you take a look at his oeuvre just over the course of just the Godzilla saga alone, not only do you more or less hear kind of the same type of music, he doesn't seem to expand or broaden, his tone, I guess, much.
I would
He
say,
occasionally does. I would argue, for example, his Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2 score
mhm.
is pretty darn unique in many respects.
Yeah, I would
Um,
say, I would say the later, like his last years as composing, I would say are probably his best because it seems like he was starting to really broaden out,
yeah,
like what
and
you said there.
necessarily wrong with a maestro having his or her unique flavor. Like Michiru Oshima, by and large, copies her own music from each Tezuka Godzilla film to the next, with maybe some occasional new stuff and some minor
Hmm.
tweaks depending upon what the film calls for. And again, I'm not totally against a composer having his or her own sort of unique sound, but um it does get distracting sometimes when it by and large sounds the same too.
Hmm.
um Take for example, and I know I used this before, Masaru Sato. He sort of has a slight unique sound, but his isn't quite as recognizable as Ifukube's, because when you look at the Godzilla films he scored, they are so different enough that at the very best, you might be able to pick up very small hints of similarity. Otherwise, you would assume it was done by a different composer.
Hmm.
His score for Raids again is different from that of Ibra. It's different from that of Son of Godzilla. It's different from that of versus Mechagodzilla in '74. And I think those were the only four films he scored. And each one is different. You would not necessarily know, that it was the same composer, more or less. And I'm not trying to bash on Ifukube. I do love his music. I feel like I got to defend myself because I almost feel like people are just kind of like on me. I love Ifukube. Do not get me wrong, but it would be nice to occasionally have some broadening. However, when it comes to the Daimajin trilogy, I'm willing to cut him some slack because, again, all three films were produced in the same year,
Hmm.
and I'm sure there was not a whole lot of time to score some unique tracks for each film.
Right.
Not only that, this is 1966. This is a film that we are discussing in this Daikaiju Fest. War of the Gargantuas also came out the same year. He was a busy man
Hmm.
that year. At the bare minimum, at least to my knowledge, he has scored four films that year. That is not going to be an easy task to do.
Oh no.
So when it comes to the year of 1966, I'm willing to give him some slack. But at the same time, too, I do love these scores, even though, yes, the Daimajin scores sound very similar to what we hear out of the Godzilla films. There is a hint of uniqueness with them that you're not going to hear within the Godzilla saga of the same time period. And he is a very good maestro. Again, do not get me wrong. I love him and I love his music. I do listen to his scores. Usually a bit more than I do most of the other maestros within the Godzilla saga. Um, but yes, his sound is very similar. For example, and I've talked about this before, it's probably been a number of years on this podcast, where his score between Ghidra and Monster Zero is virtually identical. There are some minor differences, but I've always said if I were to pick one or if I were to recommend one over the other, I would do Monster Zero because Monster Zero, in my opinion, is a significantly better score than Ghidra. Um, Not to mention, I think you get certain themes and marches within that particular film that you do not get with Ghidra. Um, so, like a score like Ghidra is one I really don't listen to much at all because, like I said, it's so very similar to Monster Zero.
Hmm.
And I love this guy. Don't get me wrong. I feel like I'm spending 5 minutes defending myself, but
Yeah, quit it.
at the same time too, I think we as fans need to also sort of accept the fact that Ifukube never, at least for the most part, didn't necessarily spread his wings, so to speak, as much as, let's say, Masaru Sato did during the 4 films that he scored. Um, and again, that's not to say I dislike Ifukube's music. I don't. I love it. But
Hmm.
if you've heard more or less one Ifukube score from a particular decade, then in some respects you've heard it in other movies within the same decade. So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and every time when I pop in the Daimajin movie and then hear some of the scores, sometimes it, it makes my brain a little confused. Like, am I watching a kaiju movie or am I watching the movie that I actually popped in? Because yeah, as you said, it just his music just sounds a bit familiar with the other movies that he scored. And as like you, I mean, I really like the guy, and don't get me wrong, but I for every essentially for everything there has at least to be a little bit of criticism and stuff. But then, as you said, that he was composing for 4 different films within this same year when this entire trilogy came out, and yeah, he was a really busy man, and I can probably understand that it would have taken so much time to try to write up a lot of the notes and stuff for all the music for for 4 different films that year. So I can at least see why he did what he had to do, but also at the same time, throughout the decades that he composed for any of these movies, it would have been nice that he would have broadened out a little bit more. But granted, during his final years, he did start to do that. You know, with Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, um, was it
Destroyer.
Destroya, and did he do Godzilla vs. Mothra? The
He did, yeah.
yeah, but yeah, it would have been nice, however, that he could have done that for all the decades that he had time of doing. But other than that, what do you think of the visual and practical effects as well as the suit for Daimajin?
I mean, I think everything looks very good. There are some moments of, and I just forgot the term because it wasn't green screen then.
Matte
Um,
screen?
matte screen composition effects where, yeah, you can kind of see the seams a little bit. But again, I'm willing to let that go. I'm very forgiving when it comes to movies. The only time in which I will become so unforgiving with a film is if you aren't engaging me enough. And these films engage me, and I'm, as a result, am going to be much more forgiving on any flaws. And no film is perfect. Do I think I could make an A-plus film? No. I mean, I don't think I could. But there's certain things that I don't. They're not jarring. They're just unfortunately noticeable within some composition effects. But even then, it's like, okay, they did what they could with the time and the budget that they had. And again, a reminder, all three films were produced within the same year. Thankfully, each film had a different director. It wasn't the same guy, each time.
Mm.
Poor bastard, if that were the case. But, um, you know, Daiei, during this time period, uh, especially when you think about the Gamera films, the Gamera films in terms of overall quality during this time were arguably, roughly a step down from the Godzilla films. You can make an argument, though, I think, for the first two films, Gamera and Gamera vs. Barugon, that they were on the same level, if not maybe even exceeded. Uh, some of the miniature and visual aspects than the Godzilla films did of that same time frame, 65 and 66.
Mm.
Um, um, Daiei, didn't necessarily have like the money and the resources that Toho had, but for what they had, it was very darn good. I mean, I do think in terms of set building, I think in terms of composition, I think in terms of the effects for Daimajin itself, it's all spectacular. And are there maybe some moments to where it does almost kind of seem like, yeah, for sure they're on a set? Yeah, kind of, but you know what? They did their damnedest, and I buy into it. I'm like, okay, this is a forest within feudal Japan somewhere,
Mhm.
and I like it. You could argue that definitely some of the composition effects don't um, age as well up to this point, but I would say they still age decently.
Mhm.
It's not like a complete travesty. It's not like someone took a marker on a white piece of paper and threw it in the background and said, "Look, this is a waterfall," and he or it's Daimajin parting the ocean to get from this island to go inland and kill this authoritarian individual and his regime. Um, they tried, and I think for the time period, it was considered really good. Now I would consider it's still pretty good, and despite some of the seams showing, but I think they're good. I'm willing to give them an A because I still think it works well, even by 2021 standards.
Mhm. Yeah, I really do love the setting building that they've done, and they weren't really Toho at the time, which they probably had, banked quite a bit of money, especially with them dominating the whole cinema landscape there in Japan, even through today. But with what, as you said, what Dai had to deal with, and with all the set building and everything, it's really remarkable with what they have done. And just with the scaling, granted, comparing it to whoever was portraying Daimajin through the films, I'm not sure if it's the same dude or
It is. It's
different.
Riki Hoshimoto.
Okay. Uh, yeah, just comparing him to all the set buildings, with the castle in the first one, they've done a phenomenal job with the set building, with the miniatures for the castle and such, and just uh, with his huge arm when he grabs some of the villains and then smashing them into the wall and everything. Granted, you can maybe kind of tell the difference when it's not really, just a big,
And that's one of the things I was
arm and
talking about. I
hand.
forgive.
Yeah, it's it's still amazing with what they did, and just having them crushing these people into these walls and everything. It just makes it. It almost makes it look believable in a ways, but you can still at the same time kind of tell the difference when it's a little bit fake. But as you said, I would at least forgive it. Because I mean, you're sort of having your mind turned off and enjoying the movie and having a good time watching it for the last 15 to 10 minutes of at least the first one and maybe the other two. But with them having really good human storytelling, I mean, you really throughout these three movies, you're basically entertained and enjoying with what you're watching. But yeah, with some of the match screen, I think they've at least sort of aged well over time. I know there's at least some aspects that I've sort of uh, closely looked at. Some of them didn't quite age well, but I mean that's sort of what Dai had to deal with at the time because they didn't quite have the money that Toho had during that same time. And granted, this is sort of right around the time when TV was starting to become popular and the theater experience wasn't was starting to decline at the time. Well, with Ultraman, uh, I'm not sure he was starting to become popular at that time or a few
Oh
years
yeah, this
before.
Ultra 7 was on, I think, at about this time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's right. That's right. Yeah. I always kind of get the year confused for that, but yeah, just with what Dai has had to come up with and had to deal with for these three movies of Daimajin, they did a phenomenal job as far as the whole practical and visual effects aspect.
Well, and one thing I really want to stress, and this is especially to people, and you and I know at least one individual within our close knit group that historically has always made fun of these types of films because they bought into this whole idea, and that is correct in a small circumstance, but overall wrong, is that the Japanese films had really cheap effects and as a result looked very, very goofy. That is not entirely true. You take a look at these Daimajin effects, for example. Do like you were talking about the big arm in which he's grabbing people and smashing them into walls and what have you. Does it look fake? Kind of. I mean, yeah. I mean, like certain parts of it, like a pinky or something, may wiggle if it bumps into something.
Mm-hmm.
But who cares? You take a look at some of the American horror and science fiction films around the same time. The effects were either no better, if not worse. And one of the things that, yeah, sure, things over time are going to potentially, anyways, look more unrealistic. Okay. And part of that, of course, is just due to the budget some of these films had, but a lot of it has to go
Mm-hmm.
with the technical aspect, materials, and the technology available at the times. And for me personally, and I think I've mentioned this before on our podcast, one of the things that I love about older films, not just classic Japanese TV shows or films, but even American films and American science fiction films and shows of roughly around the same period, is the fact that some of the effects work, while not looking like Jurassic Park level, that's okay because
Mm-hmm.
I love a lot of that because you get certain aesthetics that you don't really see anymore in today's movies and films. The stereotypical look, for example, of certain robots and aliens were produced in the late 40s into the 50s and 60s. A lot of those designs, of course, you're not going to see in today's movies and films because today's audiences are much more sophisticated, and at the same time, they want things to be more quote unquote realistic and grounded. And that's the charm I find in a lot of this older material. There is an innocence and there is this ability to want to just experiment, even if it wasn't necessarily something that was a knockout. The fact that they tried and the fact that it's fun.
Hmm.
And I think that's something that's missing in a lot of modern science fiction type of films, with some exceptions, of course. Uh, but there's just an aspect and a charm to a lot of the classic stuff that you just don't get much anymore. That may change with time. Who knows? Maybe the science fiction TV shows and films of now will look more charming 20, 30 years from now. Time will tell. But that's one of the reasons why I love classic Ultraman. It's not so much the stories because, well, these were children's shows at the time, and the stories occasionally, yes, could become uh, not really deep, but slightly sophisticated, but it was more straightforward in its storytelling. But I love just the fact you get two guys in suits over miniatures, bashing each other, stuff exploding and all that. There's a charm to that that I love. And my favorite Ultraman series is this original one because just that aesthetic is something I've really fallen in love with. And it's no different with the Daimajin trilogy here. There's a certain aesthetic to the effects because of the budget they had at the time, because of the technology and the resources they had at the time, that even for that time was very good, despite a very strict shooting schedule, I imagine, because again, 3 movies in 1 year, not an easy thing to do. And because again, like we've said repeatedly, Dai didn't necessarily have the money and the resources that Toho did around the same time. The fact that they were able to produce this at the time probably looked pretty darn impressive and still looks pretty darn good even today.
Yeah, and like you were saying there uh, earlier in your discussion, when it comes to the practical effects, it's not like that they were trying to make something look goofy in that way.
Not intentionally, no.
No, they really tried their best to try to make everything as proportionate and as realistic as they possibly could within the budget that they had. And
And the time.
yeah, in the time, I mean, uh, they weren't trying to make things goofy on purpose, unless if they said that it was a satirical movie or TV show at the time. They were trying to do their darnest, and we're sort of used to a lot of the movies nowadays, as you said, trying to be more sophisticated and trying to make everything realistic and grounding as much as possible. But during that time, they didn't have the technology that we have today. They had to come up with things that were available to them during that time period.
And as we're discussing this particular matter, I keep hearing August Rigoni in my ear, where he says, and I don't know if this is true even for today, but at this time, the Japanese in particular, it wasn't about trying to make something look realistic necessarily. And he could go into more detail because I don't really remember all about this, but I've heard him say it several times. And I don't know if he even said it when we interviewed him, gosh, almost 5 years ago now. Um, but it wasn't like American television and movies where you try to do your darndest to make it look realistic or accurate. It that just wasn't sort of the cultural or pop culture type of thinking within the Japanese. The Japanese, because of course they're a different nation, they are more of a singular type of people, whereas we here in America are more of a diverse group with different backgrounds of people. But at the same time, too, we are influenced by Western philosophy and culture that came out of Europe thousands of years ago, whereas Japan kind of was its own isolated place for many, many years and what have you. And the way that they go about portraying things within their culture and then eventually their pop culture is so different than how we do it here, and other countries do it their own way as well. But you take a look at like um, films coming out of Britain. In many ways, yeah, they kind of have their own aesthetic and their own way of doing things, obviously,
Hmm.
but they're going to be more similar to the films we make here than they are in Japan. And so, different cultures, and it's not, and that's one of the things that a lot of people, not only non, like I guess Eastern fans who just maybe don't watch films coming out of, let's say, China, Japan, Korea, etc. But also, even kaiju fans need to understand that that's not necessarily what the Japanese are always going for. And in fact, during this time period, that wasn't what they were going for a lot of the times, because it's just different thinking. We tend to think that certain um, motion picture aspects, in terms of how you construct a story, how you represent characters, how you do the effects, etc., we always seem to assume, without any evidence to back up the claim, that because we do a certain type of thing here, the way we construct and put a film together is going to be the exact same way they do it over there in Japan. No, there are similarities, obviously, but the overall construct of how you just execute certain things and how you tell a story and what have you is so different. Another thing is that, for example, and again, I heard August talk about this, but I don't remember kind of the reasoning behind it, is that some people, for example, may make fun of the fact that in Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2, when the dying Rodan puts himself on top of Godzilla and uses the rest of his life force to bring Godzilla back to life, that that is kind of our version over here of just some sort of weird magical thing that just kind of comes out of left field. That's not true. That aspect of kind of self-sacrifice and disappearing is part of Japanese culture in and of itself. It's because so very few of us, myself included, understand Japanese culture enough that we don't pick up on that and don't realize that. We just, again, assume that it's some sort of science fiction aspect that's just coming out of left field just because the story calls for it. No, that is not true. And that's something we all have to keep in mind when we watch these films, is that that's a completely different culture there than what it is here. There are now some similarities. A lot of that was due to the fact that after the war, we helped put their country back together. We had been occupiers for a while. They now, especially with younger generations, have been importing a lot of our pop culture, and now a lot of our pop cultures have an influence over there. But they still have their own culture and way of doing things and believing things.
Well, with that said, I really can't think of anything else. I don't know if you want to wrap this up and just kind of give your final thoughts on Daimajin.
Again, it's a terrific trilogy. I again, I think if you're coming into this expecting like another monster type of film, you're going to be disappointed. That's not what these are about. These are films set in feudal Japan that are about oppression. These are not films that are designed like Godzilla films to be popcorn films.
Mhm.
And these are films that tell, uh, kind of a serious story to them with a deity god character thrown in to kind of help be the savior. Um, so if you go in with that mindset, and uh, I think you're going to have a better time with these films. And even then, like I said, with me initially knowing that Daimajin shows up very little in these films, even I, the first time I went through all three of these films, I felt kind of disappointed, even though I knew what was coming. But again, with repeated viewings, you catch more. And like I said, for me personally, the fact that I studied a samurai course not too long before I first started watching these films, that intrigued me even more, because these are set in feudal Japan. And I think when you go in viewing these films not as just popcorn monster bash type films, I think you're going to enjoy these more. And there's a reason why these are really beloved films. I think it's a terrific trilogy. My favorite one still is Return of Daimajin. It's that second film. I think the first Daimajin is also really good. The third one is kind of my least favorite, but it's always growing on me, and I don't dislike it. it's one that I've really come to love and enjoy with time. I think it's a strong recommend for this Daimajin trilogy. I think anyone who is interested in getting into Japanese, special effects cinema really needs to check these out at some point.
Mhm. And then what's your final score out of 10 for the trilogy?
The first film, I think I'm going to give a 10 out of 10. Second film, I'm giving a 10 out of 10. The third one, I think I'm going to give maybe a 9.5.
Okay. And for me, the entire trilogy has certainly grown on me. Third one's still a bit slowly for me, but it's still sort of getting better with time for me. But if you really like the whole samurai or feudal Japan type of films, like the Kurosawa films, if you've seen those over the years, or any of the other type of classic Japanese or
Or
even
kind of a feel
Chinese,
good story, lifting people out of oppression.
that too, or like those Chinese type of movies as well. I think this would be something that's kind of right up your alley. And if you also like some of those fantasy type of films too, which I know a lot of the Japanese Chinese films tend to sort of go into those sort of things, even during this time period, uh, or even way beforehand. This would definitely be something I would say to check out, and I think it would be worth your time to see this. Um, if you have the Mill Creek version of this, but for whatever reason haven't had the time to check it out, I would suggest checking it out right now. Uh, and or at least if you had the money to spend it on. For me, I would say at
Arrow's
least
coming out with that new set in
yeah,
July.
yeah, I would say at least wait until July, which if you when if when you see this in July, I would say at least wait for a couple more weeks until that comes out. Uh, with that, probably having much more stuff compared to the Mill Creek version, which I haven't. I would say Kent does too. Um, yeah, it's. I would say it would be really worth your money to check it out, or at least I'm not sure if some of these other places like Voodoo or Amazon have something to rent. It's. I would say it's definitely worth checking out. It's all three of them have really good stories, characters, uh, really good visual effects for what Dai had uh, to do, even with probably a small budget at that time, and for really doing a good job of releasing all three films within the same year. That's sort of a feat. Uh, yeah, I would definitely check them out for what they are. And for the first one, rating out of 10, I would give this one, the first one, a 9, second one, a 9.5, and then the third one, I would say uh, an 8 or an 8.5 out of 10.
And we thank you so much for joining our panel discussion on 55 years of Daimajin. We hope you enjoyed it, and we hope you continue to enjoy the rest of Daikaiju Fest.
And we'll see you guys in the next panel. Take care.